we should transcend the discussion about governance and talk about democracy, people's right, participation of the people, and how to empower the people of Africa. We want the complete transformation and freedom of Africa. We want the complete independence of African peoples. We want an end to imperial domination and imperial military occupation, and we want the African people to control their own resources. What I'm going to say is to look at the question of Lake Chad and how we can grasp the limits of the governance discourse and the governance framework, and why Africa needs to provide a different starting point to save the planet Earth, to save Africa, and to save humanity. And therefore, the language that is used in the present discourse on governance will not help Africa. I want to start from the fact that we are here today in this room in South Africa because of the resurgence of Africa and the rejuvenation of Africa. And we have identified 5 or 6 points in the rejuvenation of Africa. And this rejuvenation of Africa is what is exciting Africans at home and abroad, and at the same time creating one discourse on governance. The main issues and why it is that universities in Africa are not discussing Kutokona Valley. This month is 30 years since the South African army was defeated at Kutokona Valley in Angola. It was a decisive turning point in the history of the world, not just of Africa. The second major aspect of rejuvenation of Africa was the anti-military struggle by people all over Africa, such as in Nigeria, fighting against Abacha. The third aspect of the rejuvenation of Africa is the World Conference Against Racism. The fact that Africans in the global African family registered that slavery was a crime against humanity, and therefore there should be reparative justice. The fourth effort in the rejuvenation of Africa was the attempt to create the organization called the African Union. I call it an attempt because the African Union is still in its teething process after 100 years of the peoples of Africa calling for the African Union. So where did the good governance come from? Good governance came from the USAID at precisely the moment to reverse the rejuvenation of Africa. The idea of good governance did not exist during apartheid. It came about by the USAID in 1994. The Center for Democracy and Governance was created to provide strategic and programmatic direction for USAID Democracy and Governance Program. And we know that the United States does not support democracy in Africa. And that is why we have young students talk about sub-Saharan Africa, because according to the USAID, you have what they call Middle East and North Africa. And we believe that the USAID, their conception of good governance is not one we can use because it is imprecise. It is ambiguous. It means different things to different peoples, and it's flexible at the intellectual level, and therefore it has no meaning for Africans. When we talk about good governance in Africa, and we support it because it's in those 7 aspirations of the African Union, we're talking about democratic rights for the African people, for their expression. So when I go to Codestria and they ask me to run a seminar on good governance for PhD students, I say no. I will only come if I can speak to the students about how to fight for the democratization of Africa. So I'll go to platforms where they talk about democracy when I talk about the fight for democratization. And I want to point out that Africans support good governance because the institutions in the world that require good governance, the two most important institutions that require good governance are the Federal Reserve of the United States of America and the internet companies. Those are the two institutions in the world where there's no supervisory authority. So the United States of America can print dollars at will. And they call it quantitative easing. And therefore, the United States of America has brought the world to the brink of a precipice in bringing about warfare to support the United States dollar. And at present, we are in the midst of a war between CHIPS and SWIFT. That is the two systems of clearing currency in the world. And Africans have a vested interest in ensuring that we have an institution internationally to ensure that when the African currency comes into being, it can have an international regulatory body. So from that point of view, we support good governance. So for the young PhDs in the room, make sure that when you're writing your thesis will not be out of date, because this war that we're in, especially at the front of Iran, this war is a multi-pronged war. I will just mention three of the prongs. Cyber warfare. You may have heard of Stuxnet. When people think of war, they think of old forms of combat. No, we're new forms of warfare. Stuxnet, sanctions and tariffs against Iran, and psychological warfare, information warfare. When that war exhausts itself, we're going to be in a new world. That war is similar to what happened to Britain and France in Egypt in 1956, when the pound and the French franc failed after that war. We're in the transition out of the US dollar. So when we speak about good governance, we're talking about how Africans can inform an international system that works for humanity. The other area of good governance is how to save the planet Earth. And this is the crux of my presentation. If I don't have any more time, I will just say what I have to say here. Saving Lake Chad is a problem for humanity. Since 1973, Lake Chad has lost 95% of its water. This is what Lake Chad looked like in 1973. This is how much water was there. This is how much water is in Lake Chad today. And we can see satellite images from NASA that shows the baseline rainfall from 1961 to 1990. And we can see that the rainfall after 2080, that the Kalahari Desert will meet the Sahara Desert if we do not do something drastic to save the planet Earth and to save Africa. And so the Lake Chad question about how to save Africa is to save African peoples. It's only in Lake Chad we find this Kuri cattle. The Kuri cattle is a cattle that swims. They're going to be extinct based on what is happening there. And as the Kwame Nkrumah chair, we must unite for economic viability, first of all, and then to recover our mineral wealth in Africa, so that our vast resources and our capacity for development will bring prosperity for us and additional benefit for the rest of the world. That is why I've written elsewhere that the emancipation of Africa will be the emancipation of man. We will qualify that because Kwame Nkrumah was writing in 1963. It will be the emancipation of human beings. So the centrality of African unification to create the kind of democratic structures for unification is what I am here to speak about. How do we set in motion those structures in Africa that will realize the aspirations for the future? And here we are sitting on the tremendous wealth. There is no place in the world as wealthy as the Congo in water. Out of the trillions of cubic feet of water that goes to the Atlantic Ocean from the Congo, the proposal is that from the east bank of the Congo River, we will have a canal going from the Congo to Lake Chad to replenish Lake Chad. And this is the work we're doing now. How we're going to create a new Africa. And this agreement was made in February of this year by the governments of Nigeria, Chad, Cameroon, and Niger. It has been around for 20, 30 years, but now the work is going on. People are talking here about security. I will not go into details about this phenomenon, which comes from the people who support governance, France and the Europeans and people in Saudi Arabia who join with Nigerians to support something called Boko Haram. This is what we have when we have the environment being destroyed. If you look here, if you look at this picture, this was where the riverbed was. People are building houses on the riverbed now in the Chari River. So the proposal is for this Transaqua to build a canal from easternly, and we'll have 2 polyfunctional areas and 11 agricultural zones, and do the 2,400 kilometers from the Congo to Lake Chad to refill Lake Chad. Now, we need governance for this because we need 1 million engineers to do this. We need 27 million teachers. We need to build the capacity to replenish Lake Chad and to save Africa. But Africa is not short of water because Lake Chad is sitting on aquifers. And here's another role for Africa with governance. One of the challenges at the international level, 40% of Africa, how many that? I can stop now if you want, but he gave me 3 minutes, so I will take 3. 40% of Africa is vast oceans of water. On the Lake Chad that is drying up is a vast ocean of water. We have not been able to come to an agreement in the United Nations at the General Assembly about what is called transboundary. We don't have boundaries in Africa. These boundaries were created by the Europeans at Berlin Conference. How to manage this water and to create the basis for cooperation across borders in Africa is what we need to do in terms of the research agenda for young students, because aquifers do not respect colonial boundaries. So the work I was doing as a Kwame Nkrumah chair is we are proposing 8 major canals. 8 major canals that will change the transportation, the organization, the planning of Africa. And of these, one of the canals is now agreed. It will be different from the current planning of the United Nations and the African Union because they have something like the Trans-African Highway. But the Trans-African Highway depends on the work of each country. There's no coordination within each country for how to go forward. So let me move towards the conclusion. Libya wanted to use the water from the aquifer to replenish Libya, and they created the Great Man-Made River. The CIA in its governance report says that if Libya built the Great Man-Made River, then they'll become self-sufficient in food, and that we don't want that. And when they overthrew the Libyan government, and I encourage all of you to read this book, one of the governance things the African Union should be taking up is to hold the United Nations and NATO accountable for the destruction of Libya and the $200 billion that is being used by Belgium to pay militias and the UN government, and the African Union refuses to do their governance work in terms of raising these questions. They'll talk about democracy and human rights, but here's an actual process that you can recover resources in Africa. They're not doing. They bombed the pipes of the Great Man-Made River because Gaddafi had said that if there was $14 billion to spend for this canal system, he was going to underwrite it, and the imperial opposition to the canal. So let me just say that Bushfires lead to bare soil leads to deserts, and we need to do this work. We need political will, social peace, mobilization and public education. That's why I came. I'm going to end. I have more slides, but I'll end here. Mobilization, public education. We have to reorganize the educational system in Africa for the unification of Africa. We have to train the engineers. We have to train the social scientists. We have to mobilize people. If we are meeting climate apartheid, we must organize as we organize against apartheid. And of course, people ask you if you're going to do this, because the government of Nigeria, Chad, Niger, they signed a memorandum of agreement with Italy and China. They will build this canal. They say, where will the money come from? The money is here in Africa. It is being stolen by the African leaders. That's why we don't do work on capital flight in Africa. And of course, you cannot build the canal system and have good governance in Africa without changing the political system. System change is what is necessary for reversing global warming. Thank you. I have more slides, but... My name is Horace Campbell. I'm from the Global Pan-African Movement, and I work full-time as a Pan-Africanist, working for the unification and freedom of the peoples of Africa. I have been, for the past 2 years, the Kwame Nkrumah Chair, the Distinguished Professor at the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana in Legon, Ghana. I also work as a Professor of African American Studies and Political Science at Syracuse University. And my teaching, my writing, and the agitation we do is for the freedom and emancipation of African peoples at home and abroad. Sleeping Lake Chad. We should transcend the discussion about governance and talk about democracy, people's right, participation of the people, and how to empower the people of Africa. It can only come into being by the way that apartheid was removed, by organizing the working people, the students, the progressive women, youth, teachers, cultural artists, progressive religious leaders. That is the only hope for Africa. We want the complete transformation and freedom of Africa. We want the complete independence of African peoples. We want an end to imperial domination and imperial military occupation. And we want the African people to control their own resources so that we have one currency, one unified people's government, and all the wealth of Africa can be used to provide food, shelter, clothing, and well-being for the good of the people of Africa.